Making the best chicken noodle soup is a lesson in aromatic layering. I think most people can make a good chicken soup, but only few can make a really stellar one. Today, I'm going to show you the underutilized ingredient that takes your soup to that next level. Chicken noodle soup has all of the components of an all-time great comfort food. Tender chicken, lots of hearty veg, noodles to slurp on, and a supercharged chicken broth. Let's start with the veggies, as this is where the secret to my soup lies. This is going to be a lot of veg, but I think it's important for both the flavor and texture of the soup. These are all going to turn beautifully tender and sort of juicy in the broth, which I think is really, really delicious. All the hits are here, so let's peel and dice a few carrots. I like carrots for the nice sweetness and texture they bring to the broth. I cook all these vegetables so they lose their crunch, but get a nice, soft, tender bite. Really, really good. Celery's here as well, but it's not my favorite flavor in the soup, so I use a little less celery than carrot, but use a ratio that you really, really enjoy. I find the flavor of the soup can really easily be overwhelmed by too much celery specifically. Onion is really, really imperative for a sweet fragrance, so dice a medium one into a nice medium chunky dice. I only had small ones lying around, so I used 1.5. Get about this much here. Okay, I've kept you waiting long enough. The reason this soup is so tasty is that it utilizes an entire bulb of fennel in addition to all the other veggies we have. The soup ends up having a really nice, sweet vegetal fragrance that's really hard to put your finger on what you're tasting. And I think it's impossible to achieve that without the fennel. In my opinion, the best secret ingredients are the ones that don't overwhelm a dish or make the dish about them. And I think that's what makes the fennel so perfect here. We can also save these fronds for a nice herby garnish at the end. That's just a little bit of extra credit. We're double dipping here on flavor. I've got one more unconventional ingredient, and that's the chicken itself. Most people think chicken noodle soup means a whole chicken, but honestly, I don't really think a whole chicken's worth it here. The white meat is never as good as dark meat in a soup like this, and you also get more skin per piece using the thigh, which means more of that good chicken fatty flavor in the soup. Use a whole one if you like it and you want to be traditional, but I don't think you're gonna miss it. This is about 1.5 pounds of chicken thigh. These are pretty large. Use anywhere from 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. This makes enough soup for probably about 4 people or so, depending on how many noodles you make. Luckily enough, that's all the prep needed for the soup. The rest of the work is all done at the stove. To add another layer of flavor to the soup, we're actually gonna brown the skin of the chicken thigh, a step you can't do if you opt for a whole chicken. In a large Dutch oven, begin browning the thighs skin side down. No need to add oil, as the fat from the skin is gonna render and leave a nice layer for us to brown the veggies in. Keep the pan over medium-high until the skins are deeply browned. And there's no need to cook the other side here. It's gonna cook all the way in the end, so don't worry about it. Remove the chicken from the pan and then add in all the diced veggies into the oil and season them with salt and pepper for now. As with any good soup or stew, it's really important to start seasoning early and often. I covered this really in depth in this video on seasoning here that I think you're gonna wanna check out. I do like to give these a chance to begin browning around the edges, but they don't need to be caramelized. A little browning goes a long way here, but don't go overboard. If you've got some lying around, throw in some hard herbs like sage. If not, that's totally okay. Just use a big pinch of dried herbs you've got in the pantry. Anything from Italian seasoning, herbs de Provence, or just generic, sage, rosemary, that kind of thing is really good here. Drop your heat to medium-low, then add a splash of white wine vinegar to deglaze the pan. This brings a little bit of acidity and sweetness, which I think really, really helps with the whole flavor of the dish. Scrape up any of those brown bits and then add in around 1.5 liters of water. To get the actual broth, I like to use Better Than Bouillon here, but you could totally just use chicken broth or stock that you prefer. A big spoonful of that Better Than Bouillon brings some nice salt and chickeny goodness. Honestly, and this goes with pretty much any of my cooking, the broth level is not a hard and fast rule. What's gonna end up happening, and this happens to me here, is I think I added too much water. I added closer to 2 liters. And so when I tasted it, the flavor wasn't right. It was a little watered down. So I ended up just cooking it longer and reducing some of the liquid levels down to a place where I was happy with the flavor. This is so important for your cooking at home. You have to be okay and be flexible with things like time and temperature and adjust to your taste and to what's working well for you. This is where paying attention and keeping an eye on things really, really matters. Now it's time to add the cooked chicken back. Keep the bones and skin on as they'll give more flavor and that nice lip-smacking fatty deliciousness. Add a bay leaf, some poultry seasoning, and dried sage if you left out the fresh sage. Let's hold off on more salt for now because the Better Than Bouillon has some in it, but I definitely like a good amount of pepper in mine, and I'm gonna adjust that here and later as well. Check your liquid levels, bring this up to a simmer, and then cover it for about an hour. Really, that time is all about letting the flavors develop and letting the chicken turn beautifully tender. We certainly can't forget about the noodles. For that classic chicken noodle flavor, for me, it has to be super wide egg noodles. The nice thing about these is that they hold texture really, really well while in a soup. They stay pretty toothsome, which I really enjoy. Some other options include classic rotini, ditalini, or even macaroni in a pinch. The main thing here for me is I like to cook them separately. I know it seems counterintuitive, but there is nothing worse than having to store leftover soup with the noodles in the broth. They lose their texture hanging out in all that liquid, and part of the joy of eating soup is the leftovers, so no way am I missing out on that. Once the hour is up and the chicken is fall apart tender, remove it from the soup to cool and get a pot of salted water on to boil. If your broth isn't at the right level, adjust it by either boiling off some of the liquid, that's what I had to do here, or adding a little more water. For me, honestly, I cooked this broth for another 30 minutes or so, just to reduce the liquid and tighten up the broth. I don't love a super brothy chicken noodle soup, but again, that's up to you. If your broth isn't up to your standards, add more salt and pepper and seasoning to taste. Once that water is boiling, cook the noodles until just past al dente. Nobody wants hard noodles in their soup, and then drain them. I was just cooking the noodles for myself, so you can see I used a very small portion, usually somewhere around like 30 to 40 to 50 grams, depending on how much noodle you want, is good per serving, so go off that. Have you guys watched Scrubs? I think there's like an intern asking Dr. Cox how much Tylenol to give a patient, and he literally says, open their mouth, grab a handful, and chuck it in. Whatever sticks is the right dosage. That's kind of how I feel about cooking sometimes. I know I often give you measurements in grams, but the truth is, when I'm at home and I'm cooking for myself and my wife, everything is fast and loose. Just grab a handful per serving, honestly. Just chuck it at the water and it'll be okay. For the chicken, we need to remove the skin, bone, and any cartilage pieces. Luckily for us, these pieces are cooked enough to really easily separate all that out with our hands. The meat should pretty much just be melting here. I mean, I can shake the bone and the meat comes off. Chop any larger chunks of meat into smaller pieces. It's not good to just like pull them apart here because you end up with these like long strandy pieces of chicken that aren't as good in a soup. You want to cut those strands down so you end up with more easily biteable pieces. Taste this to make sure that the salt levels are right and adjust it with salt and MSG. A little secret for you, just add like a nice little pinch of that to bring a little bit more of that like craveable flavor to it. You don't have to, but it's a nice touch. Remove all the stems and leaves from the herbs like our bay leaf, our sage, and if you added rosemary, any of those like little rosemary sprigs. Lay down some noodles, ladle on the soup. I broke my ladle like a couple weeks ago filming that bear video. Last time I made this in testing, I just had to like pour the soup on. So I forgot that I had ordered a ladle and it hasn't arrived yet. So I used a deli container to scoop out the broth. If you want to get really fancy, tear on some of those reserved fennel fronds and pour on a little olive oil. If you want to get less fancy and do what we do, just pour on a bunch of Cajun seasoning to bring a little bit of spice and more salt. I don't know, just something that we like. It's always what we've done. This is so nice and sweet and floral almost from the vegetables. You get like a little bit of a licoricey back note. Not a lot by any means. If you don't like licorice, don't worry about it, but that fennel brings the nicest little like, oh, what's that? It's fennel, and now you know. This soup is what you want when the weather starts to turn and you just want to sit on the couch and binge Gilmore Girls. You know, the good seasons before Logan. Massive shout out to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMarty. They get some cool benefits for supporting the channel and I get to keep making videos like this. And so I just really appreciate them. Consider checking it out and consider becoming a patron. If you enjoy this type of content, like the video and subscribe so you can see more of it and get more of me, which, you know, who wouldn't want that? If you're in the mood for an Oktoberfest type meal, check out my video on schnitzel and Bavarian potato salad. I really think people are sleeping on a brothy potato salad. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers.